Okay, so it seems like everybody here is a lucky winner. So for everybody here, go ahead and seat yourself in one of these round clusters of seats, because don't worry about where you're choosing, you're not committing to it, but we're going to be in these clusters, so it makes sense just to start here and instead of having to move everything around in a minute. Then you have to actually look at each other as well. Right. Thank you. Okay. So is everybody comfy? So, I see you're introducing yourselves already, which is great, because we were going to have you quickly do that, but it's good to see you all taking the initiative. So this is a new category for MCN this year. They calling this a deep dive, which is not a workshop and it's not a presentation. It's this new concept that they described as just going deeply into something. This is how I understood it, something actually quite practical. So we're not going to be talking big theory. We're going to be hopefully coming away with collectively, not for anything we're teaching you. This is not a workshop of teachable moments, but rather it's something we're going to come to together and hopefully come away with some incredibly concrete, practical, and pragmatic takeaways. So that's the goal. So let me make sure this is working. So this is why we're doing it. Obviously storytelling is a huge buzzword. It started really taking off about 4 or 5 years ago. You know, those of us who care about content either make it or oversee people who make it or interact with it, saw ourselves coming up out of the basement. And now we're considered integral.
Literally.
Right. Now we're seeing this paradigm of storytelling or generic content like this cartoon from the 1990s was. It's integral not only to an exhibition or a project, but to the museum's identity. But what's wrong about this cartoon, in my mind, and I think what we're going to work on today, is that this is showing content as a product, as a thing, and actually quite a warmed over, kind of messy, discussing, lukewarm hot dog sort of thing. So this is the IRS's definition of what an outside contractor, what we are, the three of us at this table in different ways. So I think this is one of the roots of the problem. Actually, why don't you read out, you want to read that out loud first?
Sure. An individual is an independent contractor if the payer has the right to control or direct only the result of the work and not what will be done, or how it will be done.
So that is a really big mistake, because it leaves out the process. It leaves the makers of the thing out of the process by its very definition. So I think that's a really big problem, and I think that's, as somebody who's been in this field these many years, that's where a stumbling block, the big stumbling block is thinking about us as creating the product we are told as described.
It's a very binary definition, and I think I'm not so good with boundaries anyway, but I think that we kind of live in a non-binary, especially as creatives, space now, and the best work comes out of that.
Yeah. So we're really going to be talking more about content as a partnership and a relationship. So we're going to sort of create this metaphorical relationship that will carry us through. So just to talk about who we are, I called these two nice folks in on this because I thought we're each three very different kinds of content providers, not in the kinds of stories we tell, but in the way we do it. So I'm a person. I'm not part of a company. I'm an independent person. I do call in people to help me with projects in my little circle of other freelancers, but I'm a person that comes to the museum as being me. And then you're the mama bear, the
Right,
medium.
I'm the mama. So we have baby bear, mama bear, and Brad bear.
Right.
So my name is Christine Murray, and I am a content specialist at Antenna. I don't think I need to explain antenna to most people, but we are a big company. We're around the world, and I work in museums all over the place. But I think the thing about my position as the sort of medium-sized position is that people usually, when they look at me, they don't see the giant company behind me. They just are interacting with me. But I usually have a team of 4 people probably that I'm working with in some way or another in a project, but I am always the kind of like creative overlord, as it were.
Creative overlord, that's nice. I am the Brad Bear and also the person representing the larger content creator. I'm the partner and chief strategy officer at Blue Cadet. Can everyone hear me? Is this on?
Yeah, it's a little
So we're a 65-person experience design studio based in Philly and New York. And we create all kinds of different content for folks, but it's been really fun to work with these two and talk about some of the similarities and differences. And I also want to give you all a pat on the back for being in here when we're in San Diego and it's really nice outside, so thank you for showing up after lunch.
Right.
One of the other things I just wanted to note is that over the course of the last 7 or 8 years, I've visited over 200 different museums. And one of the really cool things about working with so many museums, as we all do, is we get really interesting perspectives about what's working, what's not working. And I think I've gained a lot more empathy about some of the challenges that exist creating content in-house. So we can talk more about that later.
So we thought we had this metaphorical discussion about what those relationships are like. And, you know, from my decades of working in museums all over the place, we came up. So why don't you share your thoughts about?
Right.
Yeah.
I'm going to read this off my computer because my phone keeps shutting off right
Okay.
here.
Oh,
So
bad.
this will be easier. Okay, so I want to talk a little bit about starting off on the right foot, and I'm going to use the analogy of a modern dating relationship. So I've been married to my wife for about 10 years, so I didn't do the Tinder thing, but follow with me as you will on this journey. So, you know, imagine that you're on a dating site and you have a potential match. This person has a really long profile with some really exciting highlights in it. There are also some cautionary notes about how the relationship will work, though. So even though they seem interested, you follow up with a couple of questions about your concerns. You ask them how many people they're courting, and they respond by saying, "I'm not able to disclose this." Right? A little frightening to begin with. So then, nonetheless, you're intrigued by some of the high points in the profile, so you decide to swipe right. Hopefully that's the right direction. I don't know. The positive one, if you will. They follow up by saying that before you can have a face-to-face conversation, they want to know your financial background. A little weird, right? They want to know your vision for the relationship and for you to commit to paying for the first few dates, regardless of how things turn out. Oh, they also need it by tomorrow because they're really busy and they're in a hurry to get married. They sound a little demanding, but you're really looking for a companion, so at this point you're like, hey, why not? Okay, so you work frantically to supply the information. You enlist your friends and family members to take a look. You create the perfect message saying how much you're looking forward to the relationship. You submit it to them, but then again, nothing happens. A little weird, right? Time passes, and you wonder, are they ghosting me? Did I do something wrong? They said they'd let you know in a week, but now it's been a month and nothing has happened. So finally, after 6 weeks, they write back, right? And they do want to meet you. But they're also bringing on their family. The weird uncle, he's going to be there. So is the dramatic sister, the exhausted father, fiscally conservative grandma, all going to be there at this first meeting. Their cousin might actually show, but she's going to be in the car, and she's reluctant to be there after all. So, you know, it's clear from the moment you walk in that this family has a little bit of issues, but you're hopeful that when you get in, you can sort of fix all of these different ills. You put a smile on, you carefully run down your credentials about how you think you can be the best partner for this person. Despite the dysfunction, you walk out the door feeling like you made your best case. It's totally going to be worth it once you get into the relationship stage. Okay, but then again, you don't hear back for weeks. You're concerned. Was it something you said, something you did wrong? Did you say too much, too little? Would it have been better if you would have brought a friend to this first meeting? Sadly, you know that it could be great if only you had the chance to begin. So without any choice, you begin the process all over again, trying to find a new person to court. But wait, all of a sudden, out of the blue, you hear from your original match. After months, they are interested. You've moved on, but you want to play the situation out, so you ask what the next step is. And the potential suitor says, I just need to see if there's anything else you can bring to this relationship before we begin. And it needs to be legally binding, by the way, so I need you to sign this agreement. So you skeptically sign the contract and are happy to be finally moving forward after all of this. You start by prepping for the first date, but then you get a call out of the blue. They've decided to go back to their ex after all. So as you can probably see here, I'm not actually talking about a romantic relationship, hopefully. I'm talking about the process of how a lot of the relationships begin when we actually work with different museums. And I don't mean to be critical, because I think everyone sort of knows this, and it's sort of the process of procurement, but it's really hard to start off with a trusting relationship with a content provider when you're forcing them to jump through all these hoops. And it's tough because sometimes you spend hours and thousands of dollars and all this, and you don't want to be resentful because you know this is how it has to go. But I think what we want to talk about today is how to get over that little bit of a hurdle and make it a little less of an awkward beginning to a relationship. Because I think we can all agree, if you had to jump through those hoops finding a partner, you probably wouldn't kind of advance with that person anymore. So, I also just wanted to say that I realize that we kind of content providers are not perfect, so you're probably listening to me say this and you're like, you two throw us through some duping loops as well. So don't think that we're perfect, and I hope that someone will actually write a rebuttal to this and post it online to talk about how terrible we vendors are. But until that point, I'm going to turn it over to Christine to take you to the next stage.
Yeah, so I loved this metaphor, so I decided to go, I'm going to stand up so I can see you guys over there. So I decided to play this out as, okay, so you get past that Tinder stage, and you're going to go on your first date. We've all been there. So you decide this, so you choose your favorite restaurant. You decide dinner and a movie. We're going to have, baby steps. We're going to get together for like a long getting to know you session. So you decide on a dinner and a movie. So, you choose your favorite restaurant to take this person to. It's small and serene and family run and authentic, and it's a great place to have a conversation, low lights, whatever. And they have a great wine list, by the way, very important. So you walk in, and your date meets you there. They seem a little skeptical, a little maybe kind of disappointed in you, and you can't really tell why. And so it's kind of awkward at first, but you do your best to kind of end up really sparking great conversation, and you end up having a really nice time. The food is surprisingly inventive. The wine really helps. So then you connect deeply enough during this kind of conversation time that you decide to bring up that awkwardness, that first moment that it didn't seem like it was quite gelling. And your date says, well, I actually thought we would be meeting someplace that's a little bit like more buzzy, has more of a scene, maybe some artisanal cocktails, it's kind of loud and noisy and flashy. And so everybody feels bad. You feel bad because you picked the wrong restaurant. They feel bad because they couldn't really appreciate this great opportunity that they were having with you. But then you end up laughing about it because it turns out that you're both foodies. You really like this. You like each other. You had this chance to have this great conversation. And so to me, this is all kind of about goals and expectations. That up front, there are these expectations that you have to talk about, and you have to kind of create a shared vocabulary, where you're both coming from, and then also where you meet, where those two things meet. So then you go off to the movie, and even though you've just had dinner, your date decides that they want popcorn, soda, candy, nachos, and the souvenir poster along with the movie. So this is what we call scope creep. But, it's all kind of implied in the word movie. So, you buy all the stuff. And so then you walk in and you both feel kind of slightly, where do you sit? So you like to sit in the front because you want a totally immersive experience. They like to sit in the back because they like to take it all in. And so you're in this maybe an awkward relationship moment where you need to navigate this. And so you decide to compromise. You both sit in the middle. You say, let's go in the middle row. Turns out you both really like it there. You didn't know, now you do. So to me, that's kind of like compromise. Everybody feels like a winner. So even though at the end of your movie, you both feel a little bit nauseous because you've eaten all that junk food, you agree that this kind of encounter was full of surprises, and you discover new things about your process, their process, and how to communicate. And everybody feels great. So the only thing that needs to happen now is that you have to have some relationship hurdles that you get over together. They have to really get you accepted by that big family that was in the room. So they have to talk about how important that big family is, and you've got to kind of be vetted by all of them. You have to explain that you're polyamorous and there are other families that you spend time with too. And that can sometimes be awkward, but then you have to kind of have the conversation about how far you're willing to go and maybe come up with a safe word. So as you can see, these relationships get more and more complicated, but we all actually know how to do this in other parts of our lives, and this is a place where it happens just around content. So that's my,
I didn't think you were walking into a dating deep dive today.
Right.
that's
And-
why you're all facing each other.
Right.
See, we're going to make.
And then the last step that I'll mention briefly is I'm looking for the dreamboat relationship. Because not to say that a long-term relationship is the best relationship for everybody, but in terms of museum and content providers, I can say that there are so many advantages to that dreamboat long-term relationship. There's financial security, and what that means in terms of the museum is like you can get so much more out of your budget because the person you're in this long-term relationship with knows your collection, knows your building, knows what you made a year ago, how that can tap in, knows that this person on your staff who wants to be involved, no, don't get them involved because it's going to throw everything overboard. So the dreamboat, not necessarily monogamous, doesn't have to be monogamous, but that long-term relationship can really work to the advantage that that person becomes a real partner in the room, and instead of you having to explain over and over and over again on that first date who the people in your family are and who your crazy friends are, this person already knows that, they come to the table, and it's super efficient and much more creative because you've gotten this other stuff out of the way and you know what else is lurking in the family's attic and in the basement, that all those treasures that they forgot about. So, moving on. This is what's going to happen today. We're going to do a group activity that I'm going to describe in a moment. Then we'll actually have a little bit of a break. Then the second activity builds on what you did in that first short activity. These are really short. Then we'll use that second activity, which is based on, these mapping, journey mappings that nobody heard of 5 years ago that now is like mandatory that everybody does. We're doing a version of that in terms of a content journey. So it will feel familiar, and you can, since you know what it is already theoretically in terms of a journey mapping, you can see how it could actually be very useful. And then we'll have a little group therapy and some promise ring sort of takeaways at the end that are real, hopefully really practical things that will be useful. So, I pulled up a few images from the Museum of Broken Relationships, just because I thought that was a good metaphor here. So the images are just sort of fun, but this toaster of vindication shows what happens when you can get spiteful, when there's a bad content vendor relationship, and it's like, well, in terms of software, I'm taking my CMS and I'm going home. Or I'm taking that video that was on all those assets you clear and I'm taking them with me because now I own the rights. So that's what you do not want. So for these activities, even though this session was not listed as Chatham House rules, I think it would be nice that we can just be open to complain. So does anybody have any objection to us doing Chatham House rules, which means that you're not live tweeting it and that you're not, anything you share in this room just stays here. Is that okay with everybody? Okay, great. So,
Can I ask?
yeah.
Can we have all of you just introduce yourselves, like really quickly, just go around the room, like
Yeah.
who you are and where you came from? You go.
Okay, I'm Ryan Wagner, the Creative Services Manager at the Spencer Museum of Art, University of Kansas.
There you go.
Daniela Gurla, co-CEO of Acoustic Guide and managing director of Practice. I'm Kelsey Brown. I'm a graduate student at Savannah College of Art and Design.
Good idea. We're going to pass a mic.
Yeah.
Awesome. Okay. My name is Kelsey Brown. I'm a graduate student at the Savannah College of Art and Design.
Hi, I'm Maddie Barnes. I work at the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum in D.C. I do digital marketing.
I'm Teresa Van Wagner. I'm the design director at Neo-Pangea in Pennsylvania.
Julie Truman, I'm the Chief Creative Officer of Acoustic Guide.
Krista Cliver, Senior Director of Business Development with Acoustic Guide.
I'm Ilaria Duva, the CEO of Duva, an Italian company working for Audio Guide and Multimedia Guide.
John Simonello, Acoustic Guide.
Rhea Yates, Canadian Museum for Human Rights, Director of Digital Outreach.
I'm Nathan Lockenmeyer. I'm an independent designer and technologist that works in museum exhibition design.
I'm Ariana Chaiwaranan. I'm an interpretive planner at the Nelson Atkins Museum of Art.
I'm Susanna White. I'm the collections manager at the University Museums at Colgate University.
I'm Eliza Senna. I'm a digital producer at the Whitney.
I'm Mary Rosen. I'm a content strategist at Gallagher & Associates in New York City.
Hi, Corey Schulman. I do digital at the Obama Foundation.
I'm Jason Meyer. I do digital at the Museum of Science and Industry in Chicago.
Great.
Great, thank you.
So even though you all did that, just as a sort of shorthand, can you just raise your hand if you consider yourself generally a content provider in some way, either as part of a firm or on your own, or somebody who's an outsider, not in the museum? Okay. Now raise your hand if you're in the museum. Somebody either does it in the museum or chooses people. Okay, so it's about half and half, which is great. So now you have an assignment. For the activity, we want each group to be mixed of different types. So can we trust you to look amongst yourselves and swap out so you've got a kind of a mix of insiders and outsiders in each cluster?
And I think we want 3 crest right now.
Does everybody have a pen? Hopefully we didn't bring enough pens for everybody. We have markers, but those are a little fat. Okay, so the first part of the activity is, okay. So Christine and Brad are just handing out some sort of large-size Post-its. And for the first thing, we just want you to quickly, at this first thing you're doing, you're actually not conversing with people in your group. You're just like, take 5 minutes on your own. Then you're going to compare with people in your group. On your pad, write down write down something that happened that was a stumbling block in some kind of content creation process, something that happened that caused something to derail, to get, a less than optimal outcome, or something that was just a physical stumbling block. And then if you write down one of those, put a big X at the top of the page. We also want positive ones. If you can quickly just write down, if you can think of one that was just a creative spark, something that happened in the process that created a better outcome, or that allowed you as a content maker to make something that you were really excited about, like something that happened within the process that was better than you expected. And if you have one of those, make a big star at the top of the page. So it'd be great if, each of you can give us more than one, but if you can only have one of the other, that's fine.
Yeah, try for 3. Yeah. But if you get 2.
I'm not about goals, that's okay.
No pressure.
Right. So this is going to be like 3 minutes, 3 to 4 minutes, just real quick.
And how specific should we be?
As much as you're comfortable. I mean, we want to get, pretty specific. We want to get in the weeds because we want to figure out how to fix stuff. And as you're doing this, not to distract you, but I did want to point out, as part of the Chatham House rules and as part of this open discussion, for those of us in the room that are actually, call themselves vendors or from companies or whatever, we really want to make sure that this doesn't turn into some kind of pitch. So please don't write down something that you think your company or it does specially, or that, hire me because we do it this special way. Let's not let it devolve into that, okay? Okay, so in 1 more minute, what we're going to do is then within your group, and the 3 of us will sort of meander between the groups, and then for about 10 or 15 minutes, we're going to have you just show and tell with each other. And what we're hoping is that you discover that there are some that are slightly repetitious, or something that's come up more than once in either good or bad. So we're going to go around the groups and just sort of help facilitate conversation or just spy on you. And then if there's something at that end of the 10 or 15 minutes, if you all agree like, oh yeah, that one is really important, that was a terrible one that happened to me, or yes, that was great, we're hoping that maybe one person from each group after that would stand up and present like one good one and one bad one, and then we're going to go from there. Is that clear? Okay, so we're going to just wander around. So it is now like 2:05, so we'll do this till like 2:15 till 2:20. We'll see how chatty you are. If you're having fun, we can go a little longer. Like, collect your thoughts, and if somebody wants to bring up one thing that was particularly positive and one thing that was negative, and just sort of tell the group what it was, like one. Okay. So we're doing the first group now.
I'll come over to the mic. Okay, so I don't necessarily have like a positive and a negative, but I think there were positives and negatives that kind of centered around two different areas that we discussed a lot. And one was being open to collaboration and accepting each other's expertise. And I think that most of the negatives arose when people didn't feel like their expertise was being respected and your voice wasn't being heard in a project. And the positives were when you had an experience where the other party was open to collaborating and learning from you and providing their input and having just a much more respectful partnership that could result in a better product. And then the other key thing was communication, and that when communication wasn't effective, it resulted in a lot of problems where feedback was vague or expectations weren't clearly communicated. But when the communication was clear and people were open to listening to each other and really trying to be open-minded, then it resulted in a better product.
So why don't you pass that to the middle group where our spokesmodel will be?
Hi. So I apologize to all of my Acoustic Guide colleagues because they've heard this before. But we had a client years ago, and prior to our project kickoff, they internally had taken all of the stakeholders together and gone through an exercise to determine what their institutional voice was and what they wanted that voice to be moving forward. And this was their first audio tour project for their institution, so it was super helpful for our team to have that input. And what they shared with us is that they had been thinking of themselves as Tom Hanks, and they wanted to be Queen Latifah. Do you not remember? No. So, it was a beautiful visual. You could understand where they were coming from, where they wanted to go, and I enjoyed telling this story. Yeah, it was really helpful as a vendor to have that amount of clarity from a client starting off the relationship.
The negative that we had was started off with unauthorized hours being billed to us as a client, but I think it stems from actually what we've seen elsewhere, which is just shifting staff environments, like shifting development teams so that people are moving from company to company and companies are reimagining what they are actually focusing on. So you start off a relationship with one kind of firm, but 8 months later, it's a different kind of firm.
Okay. I think one of our big things was this idea of the voices in the room when it comes to the vendor and the client, museum, institution, and sort of who has the say, the editorial say-so, as you put it. And there's kind of this shifting scale of who has the say, and when that's more defined, or when it sort of naturally evolves, in your case, that's kind of when things bloom. And then in terms of successes, I think we talked a lot about sort of a creative brief at the start of a project and really being strategic right up front, kind of setting expectations together, and also good deadlining system. That was a big one that came up. And then being honest, I think that was a really good point that you made. When scope is creeping, say something and bring it up and kind of start finding solutions together.
Okay, so we're gonna pick it up again? Did everybody feel like they broke whatever they needed to break? Everybody's okay? Okay. So, if you just want to move up to the front or move your chairs around or whatever, we thought we'd have a discussion about this. The three of us are just going to, we're just going to give our impressions of how things were clustered. So we sort of made themes of your observations that roughly translate to where those things happen within a general timeline. So the first, it goes from prep to vision to the timeline itself, meaning schedule, roadblocks, trust, budget and scope, and general communication. Now the first thing that I noticed is that communication is mostly X's.
So 2 stars, 15 X's.
Right. But the thing that I loved was that prep is everything is stars except for 1. So that sort of reinforces one thing I was hoping would come up today, because I've experienced this, and I'm sure everybody here has, is that starting the project a long time before the project pays off in so many ways. If you could get everybody together and have those before any time is really even counted or whatever. So I would say that we all agree so much that this is a source of so much creativity that I would hope that maybe one takeaway we could talk about at the end is that, okay, if we agree that this is so important, have this, if you're going to do an RFP or something like that, have that written in to the RFP or to the scope of work, that it's beginning with these big meetings, and that maybe on a sense of trust, these won't be specifically billable hours, forgive me, I know you have a big firm, but, but that this is going to pay off in so many ways, even in budget savings later on, because it will avoid all these X's over here. So that was my main 2 takeaways.
I think also that idea of prep, there was a lot of conversation in the group that I was part of about creative freedom and sort of respect for being a part of the collaborative process and ideation. And so when there's prep work done, like if a institution comes into a creative kickoff meeting with clear ideas, not about exactly what the thing is going to be, perhaps, but the direction they want to go in, and even bring examples, and not one-to-one examples, but we want it to feel like Toy Story, or, we want it to be as respectful as blah, blah, blah. So, or, we want it to be like an unfolding episodic mystery, like Serial, whatever it is, so that there are actual, I love to do this, to ask the stakeholders to come in with an idea of something that they like to emulate, or to at least set a guiding
or even what
pace.
The mission is of what you're making, because very often the thing that is assumed that you're making is not the thing that you should even be making. So, but you won't know that unless you really say what the mission of this is, and then you say, okay, but you know what, you're making the wrong thing.
Yeah, I think that's a vision thing too, right? Like I have under vision, one of my pain points is that we don't actually know who we're making this for. I mean, it's just like, well, we're making this because there's an exhibition and we need it, but who's actually ingesting this, right? So that's one of my things where I'm always asking that question, right? But who is this for? Who's it for? Because that guides language, that guides experience design, that guides augmented reality versus audio versus an interactive, and sometimes that vision is already laid out in an RFP and you're just responding to it. But a lot of times once you get into the room, you can sort of adjust that vision, right?
Yeah, and you all should definitely, when we're done, you should come take a look at all these because they're really, really fascinating.
You guys are really smart.
Yeah, that's good.
Come take pictures, take them home.
Can I ask one question, Tom? Can we run into that at our museum about, we're always asking who's the audience, and I just thought the way you phrased that was helpful. Who is it for? Maybe won't get blocked by people. Oh, there they go again asking who's the audience. But what do you do when people on the team say, well, it's for all of it?
What do we do with people who say that? I usually say that's really unsatisfying, because it's like the Swiss Army knife approach to voice, which is like a 3-year-old and an 82-year-old are not speaking the same language. And so I really feel like you have to talk. There has to be I even do this when we record people in a booth. I like put an image of a person in front on the other side of the microphone so that they're actually talking to a person instead of being the narrator of the thing that's going to be like, it's like, it's all about that human connection, but you got to know who the human is, really, right? Do you have other things to say about that, user personas and whatnot?
Yeah, I totally agree with that. We do a persona exercise, which a lot of people do, but we kind of view them a different way. They're not just purely an age and a kind of demographic thing. But I
feel like I'm so much louder than you.
But it's actually like, what is someone really hoping to get out of it? If some people go to a museum because they have kids and it's cold outside and they really just want somewhere to escape. Some people want to go to feel smart. Someone wants an interesting date night. And that breaks down the sort of like, it's still tied to age in many situations, but it's actually just thinking of what are people really hoping to get out of it. And we don't just create these personas and then file them away. We actually bring them and print them out at every single meeting. So when someone who's a major voice in the room, a loud voice, is kind of driving the discussion, we'll say, remember so-and-so person, they're the people we're actually considering. You represent a voice that we need to consider, but there's other voices as well. The other thing that we had changed recently was we would do a kickoff typically, and we would sort of run the entire kickoff. And now what we'll do is we actually ask the main point of contact to run half of the kickoff. And it sort of forces them to get their ducks in a row and ask some of those questions. And it makes it feel a little bit more like two-sided instead of we're just going to come in and put on a show. So we will give them some prompts. We will help them send out a survey to people or do these other little tasks. And it's really changed how our kickoffs operate.
And to also speak to that point about who are you making this for, I've found that in the museums where I've worked, for a lot of projects, one thing that I've had to beg for, but is very, very helpful, is, the exhibition closes or the project or they're doing evaluations, and the museum then holds all this incredibly interesting evaluation information. And I have to beg for it. So I would beg the museum, share that with me, because then we go into the next meeting. And maybe there was this very often happens, there was this amazing unintended audience that actually picked up on this, and it went out into the world and got used in this way that actually none of us even expected. Now we can build on that. Or there was part of it that didn't meet audience or whatever, but the evaluation, if it stays with the museum and doesn't get communicated for the next project, that I think it sends you off into another misdirection of who you thought your audience was, because they'll always surprise you.
I think the postmortem, I think if I had one piece of advice, I would say every project should have a postmortem with both sides, and to talk about what worked, what didn't work, even if you're never going to work together again, to talk about that after some time has passed. Because, well, two things. We never freaking celebrate our victories. We never actually just take a moment to say, oh my God, we created this great thing. Look at all those people that are using the great thing. Hey, high five. That's actually important as a creative person to get that kind of validation, not to just on a Saturday go to a museum and see that people are interacting with the thing that you made, but to do it together, because that also establishes that kind of partnership, which is I didn't just make this, we made it together, and that should be celebrated, as well as whatever compromises got made that you wish didn't get made, or talking through those things, I think should be a part of your project schedule. There should be a postmortem as part of your project schedule.
Out of curiosity, how often do you get that?
How often do I do that? Get that? Celebrate?
Well, how often do you get it? But we talk about postmortem all the time,
I do them a lot, but like I said, I have boundary issues, so a lot of them involve bars and let's have a glass of champagne and toast the launch of whatever. But in terms of the actual sit down and be serious postmortem, often because I have long-term relationships also, like Sandy, we'll sometimes do them at the beginning, at the kickoff of the next one.
but I was just curious, oftentimes, a new client is a big
Yeah.
I think especially identifying if you had a roadblock or a stumbling block, or if you had something that you realized caused a problem on either end, it would be super, super helpful to communicate that.
I was just curious about, like, in the practicality of it,
Uh-huh.
how that actually might happen. But I think that I find this happen often enough, but
Uh-huh.
and it's something that we talk about.
Right. I mean, I often find out about it accidentally. Like, this happened to me yesterday. Somebody came up to me and they said, "Oh, congratulations, the museum is getting tons of feet and positive," and I was like, nobody told me, so I think, and also just begging for those internal results. I know that probably a lot of them are owned by the museum and they don't want to share every piece of data, but, it's, sometimes it needs to be a 6 months or even a year later by the time you have those numbers, but how useful that would that be to bring to the table next time?
So I was going to say, so we actually do a thing where we set 6 months after the project launches, we set in our original first proposal, we set a date for the get together postmortem thing. And as we update the timeline for whatever reason, that date is always in there as a thing that's going to happen the same way every other deliverable happens. And we sort of just bake it in that it's something that we're going to do, and we're not going to run away after 3 months after, because I think that's what happens. It's really unfulfilling on both sides when you have the big launch and then everyone just goes their way and then you see them at a conference in 2 years. So when you do that and actually put it in front of everyone the whole time as a major deliverable, it does happen. So.
That's what I was going to say. If it's in the schedule, it becomes a real thing versus something that is it's like a deliverable instead of just something that you would like to have happen.
Yeah. But I think what we can learn, because we actually did this big exercise, I think what we can learn here is that there's this negativity in the communication. Now, maybe it's because when communication was good, you just didn't happen to write that down. But I think communication breakdown seems to be a source of big frustration. So maybe that's something we can take away from this too, is to make sure baked into the process is how everybody's going to communicate. And how information will be shared, and it's not just going to be in a Google Doc, and it's not going to be, behind the scenes, but in a way that people speak up as the process is going along and can sort of jig and jag, and communication can be made better if the schedule allows for a little bit of jigging and jagging, because then you can act on the communication instead of somebody saying this isn't working, well, and then somebody else says, well, now we just have to stick to the schedule, we have to stick to this, stick to that. If you have the flexibility to respond in that moment to the communication problem, I think we would all be happier people.
And this is a question for everyone, for your calendars and schedules for projects, do you block off people's vacations, holidays, and all these things from the first day, or do you, so I'm seeing, raise hand if you sort of do that as a thing. Yeah. So,
But it involves communicating, obviously.
yeah. I mean, it's something that we're insistent on having a lot of the major stakeholders in the first interview, even if they're not going to have feedback throughout. And we say, okay, list all of your vacations to your best of your knowledge and travel right now. We're going to do every time when people are going to get busy or going to be out of town. And that also has made a big difference as well, too. Obviously, it changes. It's not perfect, but I think it's, again, anything that's visible happens. If it's not on the calendar, it doesn't happen. Yes.
I have one just anecdote story I'm going to tell about communication. And I'm really curious, I think, when we have our group therapy session to maybe have you guys share some things too. But I had this one experience where I made an audio walk, and I interviewed a curator about a piece, and it was a piece that was really deeply felt by her and deeply felt by me. And we had a kind of really intense and intimate conversation, and we both cried in this conversation. She cried quite a lot about this piece, and it was the best tape I've ever gotten. But I used it in this guide. It was appropriate in the sort of narrative that I was creating. But when it came time for her to review, and on paper, it doesn't say she cried, doesn't look like it's tear-worthy, but she was really quite overcome by emotion. And when she did the reviews, she heard, and she was like, you have to take that out. And I was, so she was in the Midwest, in a museum in the Midwest. I live in San Francisco. So this was like a phone thing where I got this kind of like hair on fire call. Like, this cannot be released. This is not good. You have to take this out. You have to re-edit. I don't want that in there. And we had a long conversation. I could not sway her. And it was going to really kind of gut the project. It was really it was the climax of the project. So I flew to Kansas City to have a conversation with her. And I sat in her office. I spent a lot of time thinking about what I was going to say. And I said, look, there's a lot of curators on a lot of audio guides, because I make audio guides mostly. There's a lot of curators on a lot of audio guides who are totally alienating because they use language that we don't understand, or they're talking, the language that they're using is for other curators and not the person that's actually listening. And one thing about you being emotional is that it kind of conveys that curators care so much about what they do. That's why they do this job. They're not just a live talking academic journal. They're actually incredibly passionate human beings. And this is a moment for you to kind of change that perception, because most people just think yapping Philippe de Montebello in my ear. And she agreed with me in the end. She let me, I had to take I pulled back. She still cries, but it's not quite as intense as it was. So we kind of compromised there. I don't think she would have ever gotten there if I hadn't flown to Kansas City and sat down with her in person. I'm not sure she would have gotten there either if she wasn't on her way to retirement, because there's a lot of worry about perception, and she sort of adopted this, what have I got to lose? This is actually great from the visitor. I might lose some professional whatever kudos amongst my colleagues, but actually this is the best thing for the people who are walking in here and trying to understand this really complicated contemporary sculpture that means nothing to most people who look at it because it's just two light bulbs. So I just think face-to-face communication also is hugely valuable. Stop the email, phone call, always as the first line of defense. Actually look in people's eyes.
So, at this point, we thought we would just sort of open it up before we do the last thing, which is just sort of do some takeaways, some practical takeaways that we can agree on that are actionable and can help us all. Before we do that, we thought we'd open it up. We are talking quite personally from our point of view. Does anybody want to just share? This is like an open therapy session. Does anybody want to share a thought? Yeah. Does anybody want to? No? They're running. Yeah. Let me just bring you a microphone.
About the face-to-face was, years ago I first got into museum build, and I said always feed your donors, never go wrong if you feed them. And I find working with, even though we are the client, working with anybody to feed them. Just go out to dinner, just have a moment together, and that starts to build a positive relationship.
Anybody else? Anybody have a big wish that they, the one thing that they wished worked better from whatever angle you're coming from?
Do people do face-to-face reviews of major deliverables, or is it always remote?
Oh, that's such a good question. It's always remote in my experience.
But even internally at a museum, when a vendor or client or a collaborator sends you something, do you get everyone in the room and talk about it, or is it always just people emailing or commenting?
I will normally do it walking in the museum, not sitting, because it's easier to convince them about the feeling you have, no? Because it's very hard to explain them sitting. But while you walk and you say, let's cut the sentence here because it's too long. They never think it's too long, no? It's always too short. So doing that in the museum always helps a lot because they have the feeling of the tour, no? of the experience.
One thing that we wanted to bring up also is nomenclature. Actually, why don't you just advance to the next one? That, yes, we're in our therapy session now. I think I hear us all using very different words to describe the relationship. There's vendor, there's partner, there's provider. So we thought, I mean, how many people in the audience, how many people, if you work in a museum, call anybody that you work with a vendor? Or is there sometimes, is it described differently? Vendor?
Emails, vendor.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's something we were sort of just chatting about the other day. Like, I know we are technically a vendor, and even at this conference we're considered a vendor, but it's always just such a strange thing to me because we work so personally with people over such a long period of time that, you know, a vendor to me is someone that will give me a product, right? If I'm looking at buying a toilet for my home and it's the same toilet, a vendor will sell me that same toilet and I can see who can do it the best. I sort of view us as like a very important team member, and again, this is just our perspective that we don't call our people clients, we call them partners or collaborators, that they're not just our client in the same way that we're not a vendor. We sort of work directly with them. And it's not like it's an offensive thing, and that's sort of just a standard RFP term or a contracting term. But I do think it's another one of those like little things that as you're kind of reaching out to people, you can do it and say, okay, we want to be your partner, we want to work with you, we all want to succeed, and we want the same vision.
And I think it ties into what we talked about with the first images, the idea of it being a vendor sells you a product. So if we all agree that this is more of a process, I mean, I think a hat that I often wear is I'm often called a content strategist, because then what you're helping with is not only making the thing, but leading up to the thing. So this new idea of the content strategist as a consultant, I think feels more appropriate if you're in the mindset that you're creating a process with someone.
I was just going to ask the group a question because I heard this kind of come up when we were in our smaller groups about kind of really getting at creative freedom and getting, I mean, I think that we're all after the best possible content, and a lot of times that means getting to some kind of creative space, perhaps, that we wouldn't get to on our own, or if we were just in this product way, you know, just delivering the same thing that we've done 100 times before. And so I just wonder if you guys have ways that you talk about or create environments where, you know, you're just free to ideate, be creative, spitball. Brad calls it popcorn, you know, just like a kind of free space around a project that doesn't necessarily have to be the answer. Could just be like inventing a fiction in order to get your juices flowing. Do you guys have any kind of processes like that in place inside your institutions or companies? Mary, you do?
Wireless.
So this is just within our team, so it's not with a partnering museum or institution, but we have sort of early brainstorms that are kind of very regimented in a good way. We kind of have this creative brief that goes out to the participants in our brainstorm. It's 15 people, and then people pair off, think of things to satisfy the goals of the experiences, and then we all come together, we post up our ideas, we see what everyone likes the best, and it becomes this sort of creative space where you're taking from things, and things become other things, and I've found it's sort of a new process we've started, and I've found it really helpful. So in general, I think early brainstorming.
We do something similar. So we brief everybody on the project in advance, and then we gather as a group, and we are always trying to put an emphasis on punching up other people's ideas, because it's one thing to stand in a circle and everyone's like shouting their thing out into the world, but like if you don't have anybody to punch it up or like collaborate or be like, oh yeah, that is a good thing, but if we did it this way, then we could also turn it around and like do it that way. So I think that like just getting people together to talk about those ideas and having the type of culture to support that is always worthwhile. So that was more to like add on to what you guys do. But something else that happens more like when we're in a project stage is somebody has an idea, don't hold it back, share it with everyone else. Maybe there's a way to accomplish it, even if it's not in scope, or you may not have the time to do it. So we're always trying to encourage, yeah, because you're going to discover things along the way that you may not have thought of at the beginning, but they would be great, like a great outcome at the end.
You know, obviously teams change and someone else gets hired, whether you're a museum or a partner organization, a content creator. Do you have a manifesto document or something like that that captures those major points that gets shared with those people as they're onboarded? Or do they sort of just jump right in? Yeah. But the thing is, if they miss those early stages and they miss the previous deliverables about like sort of the context for a project, it's hard, I feel like. And it's just the reality if people go out in paternity leave or maternity leave or get hired. I think like having that document, the single document that's the one-page manifesto that evolves with the project and it's always the accurate portrayal of it, is a great way of onboarding them.
Let me just add a note to that about how important those are. I mean, it's interesting because the first time I heard manifesto on a project like 3 years ago, everybody laughed, but it's a great term because for me it helps because then it's a defensive object because everybody agrees on it, but then one post-it that's come up here a couple of times is that somebody all of a sudden has the right to sign off or has the right to review that wasn't involved from the beginning. So if you have the manifesto, that person can't stick their nose in because you can all say, but that doesn't match the manifesto. So you have something to defend your vision against the person from marketing who all of a sudden wants to have sign off on the final.
We do have something similar. We don't use the word manifesto, but we call it a log line. So it's something that clearly defines the goal. We want to do this so that this will happen. And this is our guiding force. It's our log line for the project. And it's something that isn't developed at the very, very beginning. It's developed like after a couple conversations with our client partners. And so like we have a better definition of what we're creating. And then, you know, maybe it's like a month into the project, but then we have an official kickoff. We share the log line, we discuss it, we make sure that it's on track. And then we always have that thing to go back to and say, are we meeting the goals of this? Is it what everybody intended to create? And if there's any deviation from it, you know, let's talk about it.
I think we're all getting a little tired. Yeah. I think the last thing we wanted to do, maybe this has already come out, our plan was, you know, in order to be flexible, we were going to each list a couple of things that were our dreamboat scenarios, but maybe do you feel like that's already come out in the discussions? I feel like it has, so I think we can say, but I'm wondering if for the last thing, if we just want to, got to write something on the pad. So I'm wondering if we can say, you know, in the spirit of the mission of these deep dives, which is come away with something practical and actionable. If Brad, who has the nicest handwriting, walks over there, can we like throw out 3 things that we say, okay, we took this away and we're going to try to put this into the process of whatever our next project is. Who wants to, you know?
I can write.
Okay, you can write.
The one thing that I was thinking of, when we were prepping for this discussion, we all talked about what our sort of dream thing was, and none of the 3 of us said it's like the biggest budget project ever, right? Like, we've had terrible projects with large budgets, we've had amazing projects with small budgets. We talked about, my answer was that if we have a really good designated point of contact, even if it's an outside person that's sort of like an owner's rep, that will define that it will be a very successful project. And that's something we've advocated for more and more. It can't be someone's second job or third job or fourth job. It's got to be their priority to wrangle everyone. And that's like the greatest thing that I could say of what makes a dreamboat client.
So, right, my thing was about being, I mean, some museums I work with now bring me in, like, really with the designers, and we're sitting down at that process, because it's not only the things you're making, but you're creating a experience. So now it's not just about what you're making, but it's like, what's the environment when they first walk in? What happened? What happened with the staff from the moment they walked in? What happened when they were handed something? That's all part of the thing you make that they run into 20 minutes later. So it's all this experience is all together. So getting there earlier and earlier is something that's been hugely important for me. And along the budget lines, I totally agree. We were talking I personally think something that's really big budget, sometimes I feel is less creative because there's more people in on it. It's less able to be flexible. And, you know, like one of my favorite projects I ever worked on was this video series that was incredibly open. We didn't know what we were getting. I hate it when there's a really, really, really tight storyboard, because you go out and you want to see what you get. And if it's a lower budget and it's sort of scrappy and you aren't having to meet certain expectations, those, to me, can be the most exciting.
So my big thing, I think, is in the vision category. I really think that content is most successful if it starts in the land of yes. This is my thing. I like to create a meeting. I don't call it a meeting. I call it a visit to the land of yes. And sometimes we lay on the floor and we close our eyes and we shout things out. And sometimes I do a bunch of different kinds of things. But I like to divorce the vision a little bit at the beginning from what the final thing is going to be, to kind of maximize creativity. And just, you know, if we had the biggest budget in the world, if we had no constraints, if we could make it this for every single person that walks in, if we could make this bespoke for every single person in the museum, what would that look like? What if it was a movie and not an audio guide? What if it was an amusement park ride instead of an audio guide? You know, so I like to just create an environment for one meeting, except it's not a meeting, it's a visit to the land of yes, where whatever you say has no stakes, because it really frees people up to think outside of the constraints of the thing that they're delivering at the end. So does that make sense? It's kind of my kooky mind.
What should Brad, okay, so.
I wrote just what we said. I will write whatever else.
Okay.
Do you guys have any things that really resonated with you that Brad should write on the thing? Because, you know, we have to report back to the overlords of the conference that you guys got something out of this.
Or something you'll actually, maybe if you're in a museum or if you're in a production group or something, you'll take back and say, okay, I went to this thing, we sat in the room for a long time, this is the one thing that struck me that I'd like to try.
I would say cultivating transparency in the relationship.
And how would that happen? What would you do to make that happen?
Let's say most of it happens already, but I think, you know, we were talking about scope creep and budget creep and that kind of thing, and sort of instead of beating around the bush about it, or, you know, little passive-aggressive emails, not that I would ever do such a thing. You know, hey guys, this is
Right.
where we're going, and I mean, the truth is that I find one way to build a relationship on trust is to also say, give us feedback, and things aren't going well, don't wait until the end of a project for it, you know?
Right.
Sometimes there's a little too much, we just gotta get through this.
Mhm.
And instead of sort of maybe having some version of a visit to the land of yes, and halfway through, like, let's lie on the ground and talk about what ain't going so great,
Right.
you know, whatever.
Right.
I do think, yeah.
So in other words, use your words.
And encouraging it
Yeah.
on your partner's side
Yeah.
too. And so then you're developing something together and a relationship then based on that kind of trust.
Okay, that's great.
I definitely think that how you deal with conflict is as important as how you deal with success. And there's a lot of times that we see a conflict, or there is a conflict, and we don't, or we see a problem, or we see an obstacle, and we kind of don't want to address it head on, and then it becomes a huge problem. If it's sort of like the fear of not addressing it, it increases exponentially because it actually gets problematized later. So it's never as scary to say, hey, actually, I know that you want to add these 2 amazing artists into your audio guide, but it's actually going to cost a shit ton of money. And so we need to talk about that right now. Do you want to take it out of some other place, or can we actually live without it? Instead of just being like, sure, we'll do that, and then it becoming a big problem because you go way over budget.
Is there maybe one more?
The idea of having the manifesto of the project that we don't know, we don't do.
Okay.
So I think this is one of the things that, because this is one of the things that I wrote.
Well, if you're
down.
Italian, you should know all about manifestos.
Yeah.
You invented them.
Yeah, but we don't do it for projects, so I think it's a good idea to have it as a cover of the project. So,
and then also, it's a way that everybody is forced to be together and to lay it out and hash out the stylistic differences and everything.
But it clears things. Maybe you have the feeling that things are clear, but maybe they're not. So when they're written down, it's okay. And the second thing is having the weekly.
The
weekly
standing
meeting
meeting.
already, scheduled, and making a brainstorming in between, because when you know better about the project, so these are the things that I'm bringing home.
Great. Anybody else? Last call. Yes.
Something that I picked up from actually another area recently was, I think making an event out of the kickoff that includes possibly going off-site. I think in particular, taking the museum people out of the museum to another location helps remove all the institutional blinders and sort of like bumpers in the bowling alley, and opens up the additional discussions.
Great, with food.
I was going to say, the food, that I'm going to take that away.
Okay.
People get along better when there's food.
Okay. Okay, well, thank you, everybody. If anybody, I invite you to take pictures of that for your action items.
And definitely check out everybody's
these out.
comments, because
Yeah.
it was really enlightening
Really
for
interesting.
us.
So we're going to take
Thanks
lots
for
of pictures.
coming.
Thank you, everybody.